I'd been meaning to write a book for years. Like so many of us, do we ever get round to it? But it took the terrible pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, for me to eventually do just that. Having to shield at home, there wasn't very much else to do, and somehow it came right to the top of my list of stuff to do. And I felt that there were lots of parallels with my young days and with 1943, with the Second World War days, whereby we had to do without. We had to make do. And of course, the slogan put out by the government was make do and mend. And so I decided to call my book Just Making Do. Of course, so many people made sacrifices for us during the pandemic and in those wartime years. Some people sacrificed their lives, some people sacrificed their freedom. And countries across the world, of course, shared those terrible times. And in recent years, where we are still having to cope with this COVID problem, it gives us a reminder of how fragile life is. Now, I grew up in rural North Devon, and my family had a small rented house in Barnstaple, and their dear friends had a rented small holding in the country about 7 miles away. And they both helped one another through difficult times. There were no bombs falling there in those days. North Devon was very fortunate. But there were other problems, of course, rationing, which everyone had to cope with, and the influx of hundreds of young children who were evacuated to safety. And many of them, of course, were fortunate and had happy times in North Devon, some perhaps not so fortunate. Well, the back of the book, superimposed upon a ration book, which everyone had to contend with in those years, tells you more about it, about the book. In 1943, a close friendship develops between two families in wartime North Devon, one renting a small terraced house in Barnstaple and the other living on a rented small holding in the country. While they have to cope with illness, rationing and evacuees, American troops arrive to carry out military manoeuvres on the magnificent beaches, and a mysterious tenant comes to live at a secluded cottage on the Fortescue estate. Why does he shun all contact? Make do and mend, as I've said, was the wartime slogan put out to the nation in World War II, and this book tells how the two families, with determination, kindness and humour, find different ways of just making do. I'm going to read some excerpts from the book, and I really need to start with chapter 1 because that gives you a little bit of detail about the family living in Barnstaple. One of the central characters is Margaret, who happens to be my mother. Margaret was going to be late for work at the bakery. It was raining hard as she hurried from her parents' terraced house where she had left her toddler. It didn't help that her little girl was such a slow eater, picking at her food and stopping to daydream, while Margaret became more and more agitated. She believed in giving the child breakfast before handing her over to her mother, feeling it was served as a disciplined routine, but at times it was more of a torture for them both. Thankfully, Diana, her 7-year-old, had left home earlier, walking the half-mile into the town to her infant school. The job at the bakery was vital to her, since Jack, her husband, had been admitted to the sanatorium over 60 miles away. He had been sent at first to Hawley, in their hometown of Barnstaple, where very few came out alive. But Margaret's mother had gone to the doctor and made such a fuss that he was then sent to Hawkmoor County Sanatorium on Dartmoor, where some people did eventually recover. He'd been there for over 18 months, and it was still uncertain whether he would ever walk out. Tuberculosis was a killer. Margaret's mother was a kind woman, but a force to be reckoned with. Working class she may be, but she knew how to stand up for herself and her family. Margaret was fortunate that her parents lived in the next street. The front door of their small terraced house was almost opposite the back door of hers. The support she had from her parents enabled her to earn enough money to pay the rent and even put a little bit into her post office account. Margaret and Jack had married too young, started a family too soon, and struggled with their health, while knowing that money was short and jobs in their part of the world were few. In any case, most women stayed at home, leaving their husbands to bring in the money to support the family, although the absence of so many men fighting in the war had softened attitudes to some extent, even in the traditional southwest of England. Jack wasn't going to be doing any fighting apart from fighting for his life. His chances of returning to the family were similar to those of his brother-in-law returning from serving his country. But Jack had a positive outlook and a hard-working wife. As Margaret crossed the long bridge over the River Tor, a sudden gust from the southwesterly wind blew from the estuary, almost hurling her into the road. She gripped the railings to regain her balance and looked down into the swirling waters of the river below. Bending her head and turning it away from the cutting rain which lashed her face and plastered her hair to her head beneath her headscarf, she reached the end of the bridge, crossed the road and ran up the high street to the bakery. She was 6 minutes late. "I'm sorry, Doreen, I couldn't get her to finish her breakfast," Margaret said, hanging up her dripping mac and scarf and putting on her apron, ready to serve in the shop. Some days she was asked to help in the bakehouse, cooking and decorating the cakes. She loved doing that and showed a considerable flair and willingness to learn. But today wouldn't be one of those days. It was Tuesday and one of the 2 market days for the town. Margaret would be wanted to serve in the shop. She dabbed at her wet face with her hanky and began to put on her white hat. "No, Maggie," Doreen said, lifting a tray of Chelsea buns and putting them in the window. "They want you back in the bakehouse. You better be quick. There's a panic on out there. We're very short-staffed today." She'd just have to manage on her own in the shop, Doreen thought. It would be Tuesday. Of course it could be worse. Friday was even busier. Margaret's eyes lit up as she hurried through the door to the passageway leading to the bakehouse at the back of the shop. Beautiful smells wafted towards her, freshly baked bread, scones and dough cake just out of the ovens. This was her favourite moment. Scents and sounds of kitchen activity, banging of trays on tables, pounding of dough, and the bakers calling and chiding one another, teasing and laughing. She loved it all and wanted to be part of it, creating and organising, learning all that they knew, and more besides. She stepped into the bakehouse, her feet echoing on the shiny stone floor. Bert looked up, but his usual welcoming smile was missing. Margaret looked round quizzically. Where was everyone? There were only 2 bakers to be seen, Bert and Frank, his young apprentice. They were running around the bakery, taking loaves of bread from the ovens and picking up uncooked rolls to go in, shouting instructions to one another. "Frank, knead that dough while I finish these custard tarts," Bert shouted. "First, Bert, pass me that bowl near you," Frank pointed, stretching out one arm to receive it while balancing a tray of small loaves he'd just taken from the oven. Master and apprentice had disappeared. It was a dual act, each of them on equal terms, as each man, with an expression of desperate concentration on his face and an occasional frantically jerking glare at the large clock on the wall, did the work of 2 men. Margaret was thrilled. Her adrenaline raced. She was wanted to come to the rescue, and she was ready. With a quick assessment of where she could be most useful, she made towards the piping bags, laid out on the far table in the corner of the room. This was going to be her moment, to prove that she could do the work without assistance. Looking around at the rows of naked fairy cakes, just waiting to be dressed up for display in the shop window, she reached for the icing bowl and the palette knife. "No, no, Maggie," Bert shouted. "We don't want you here." "Well, we do, but there's something we want you to do is much more important. You'll have to manage on your own for 10 minutes, Frank. I'm going out to the yard, finish my custard tarts and watch out for those cakes in the second oven." Pulling Margaret by the hand from the bakehouse, they left Frank frozen to the spot with his mouth open. Once in the yard, Bert looked at Margaret and started to explain. "Now you see, Maggie, we're in a tight spot today. We've Minnie, who usually comes in to help in the shop when we're short of staff, off sick, and Percy from the bakery visiting his father who's ill in Bideford. George helps out on Tuesdays and Fridays with the baking, but he's hurt his back lifting a sack of flour. Now to cap it all, Ron, who drives the van for our deliveries, has broken his leg, falling over his allotment. It was so careless of him. I don't know what he must have been thinking of. He knows how busy we are." "But wasn't it an accident, Bert?" Margaret asked, concerned about her colleague, although she hardly knew him. "Well, yes, but he should have known better and been more careful. He knows it's our busy time leading up to Easter." Bert led Margaret towards the van, parked on its own in the loading yard. "Now, Baggy, this shouldn't take long. We want you to drive the van and do the deliveries for today to Lanky and Swimbridge." Drive the van?" Margaret was confused. "But I can't drive, Bert." "Of course, I understand that. I didn't think you could, but you're a bright girl and we'll pick it up in no time." He pushed her towards the front of the Morris van and opened the driver's door. "Now the van is loaded up with all the deliveries and there's a list of customers and the costing for each item. Some are orders, but it's all written down, and here's the satchel with the purse for the money. There's some change in it to start you off. Oh, and here's the map." "But I can't drive, Bert." "That's why I'm going to give you a little bit of instruction now, Maggie. Right, now get in and sit behind the wheel." Bert pushed the terrified Maggie into the driving seat. "Oh, you can't see over the dashboard, can you? Oh, just a minute. I'll fetch you a cushion." He disappeared and Maggie could hear him shouting to Doreen for a cushion from the shop and telling Frank that he should have taken the cakes out of the oven. "Now, here we are. Sit on this, Maggie, and I brought you my woolen jumper to go behind your back. There, that's better, isn't it? You can see fine now. Right, let's get started." Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles showing white. It had been a short amount of instruction, and she'd had trouble keeping the motor running and had stalled the van several times when pulling away and trying it out around the yard. But Bert had gone back to the baker and she was on her own. He'd driven the van out onto the road by the river and she'd been left to get on with it. Margaret sat to attention, back like a ramrod, neck stretched, so she could look through the windscreen at the road ahead. The thick woolen jumper behind her enabled her feet to reach the pedals. Accelerator, brake, using her right foot, clutch and gear stick. Then there was the handbrake. She kept saying them over in her head, trying to visualise them without looking down. Gears 1, 2 and 3. Oh, and neutral. You had to stop the stick in neutral and use the clutch pedal twice when changing down. Double declutch, Bert had called it. "She won't get up a hill without you doing a double declutch, maid," he'd warned. "First gear is for starting and for hills, up or down. Oh, and be careful starting off on a hill. If you don't hold it on the clutch, you'll keep slipping backwards, so keep the handbrake pulled up and don't let it go until you feel you're keen to pull away." Bert had made the van sound like a young filly trying to get over a jump instead of a motor vehicle. "She'll get it there, maid, don't you worry." He had such confidence in the van and brushed off her apprehension with a shrug. "You can ride a bicycle, can't you, Maggie? Well, there you are then. She's ticking over lovely now, so put her in first and get on." With a wave of his hand, he'd promptly disappeared back into the yard and made for the bakehouse. Well, no driving lesson other than 10 minutes. That is true. My mother told us that. She was absolutely terrified and, of course, made a lot of mistakes all over the place on the way. But then you didn't have to have a driving test. You didn't have to sit a driving test, let alone do a theory exam in those days. So the people who were allowed to use a vehicle, many of them had never even had a decent lesson. They probably just got in the car or the van and had a go at driving it. Petrol was rationed and it was very strictly controlled, the use of it. So people like doctors, vets, farmers, they would be the main folk who would be entitled to drive a vehicle of some sort. So on the road mostly there'd be vans, delivery vans, occasional tractor, that sort of thing. Well, what about the other family? The family in the country, living on the small holding. I should say that the husband and wife, they had no children. They were very kind people. And dashing on ahead to chapter 12, they're about to receive something rather unexpected. The husband, by the way, not only ran his small holding, but he was also the postman for West Buckland and East Buckland and the area around Philly as well, near South Moulton. Of course, he had a bicycle for the post round, but the hills are so steep in North Devon, he did a lot of it pushing the bike and walking. So here they are. He's got home from his post round and he's just about to now be ready for a bit of a surprise, I think. "I don't know what the problem is," Stan said as he pushed his pudding plate away. Rhubarb pie and custard with their own clotted cream was one of his favourites, so Lil thought she had caught him in a good mood. "Well, the letter only came this morning. The envelope be all dirty and creased and it must have gone astray because it was sent last week. Today's Friday and she's coming this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Stan looked up from contemplating his empty pudding dish, wondering if he could cope with another helping. "Who's coming this afternoon?" he asked casually. "Stan, did you talk to Mrs. Bowden and her sister Miss Chugg over at East Buckland about their 2 evacuees? Why have they got to give 'em up?" "Yes, Mrs. Bowden's got to go to Crediton to look after her mother, 'cause her fell and broke her arm. Mrs. Bowden have written to the billeting officer and told them us could have the lad." "Oh, and what about her sister? Can't her have him?" "No, 'cause her lad's little brother is billeted with her and he can't stay there 'cause Miss Chugg's got problems with her house. I forgot to tell you, the thatch caught fire over a week ago and then it rained in the night. There'll be a lot of work to do on the place, so Miss Chugg is going with her sister to help out in Crediton." Lil frowned. "When Mr. Bowden passed on a few years back, wasn't Miss Chugg going to move in with her sister?" "That's right, Lil. But then the 2 ladies took on the 2 evacuee brothers, one boy in each of the 2 little houses." Lil nodded. "Yes, I know they cottages are not very big. So does that mean that both boys have to be billeted, Stan?" "Mrs. Bowden told me that I would write and ask the billeting officer to try to keep them together. They was almost next door to each other in East Buckland. Anyway, what did that letter say?" Lil sighed. "You read it. I'm going to make up the base for the little lads." She left the room and went upstairs. Stan took the letter out of the crumpled envelope and read it. It was from a local government officer named Mr. Andrew Morgan. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Webber, Mrs. Bowden of 2 Beech Lane, East Buckland, has written to inform me that she and her sister, Miss Chugg, of Corner Cottage, Beech Lane, East Buckland, are no longer able to keep the evacuees formally billeted with each of them due to unforeseen circumstances. I understand from Mrs. Bowden that you would be willing to house the 2 boys concerned, which would be especially helpful in enabling them to stay together. The boys are Jimmy Cooper, aged 9, and his younger brother Danny, aged 7. Their home is in Poplar, East London, which has suffered considerable bombing in the Blitz. We will let you have details of their family in due course, together with information regarding the money granted to you to help with the cost of care. Mrs. Ellington Smythe, one of our volunteers from the evacuation panel, would like to call on you with the boys on Friday next at 3 p.m. Mrs. Bowden highly recommended you, and in offering these children a home, you will be playing a vital part in helping the war effort. Many thanks. Yours faithfully, Andrew Morgan. Stan lit his pipe and drew on it. The boys would be pupils at Philly Primary School, so there would be no change to that arrangement, although they could go to Swimbridge to school. Best to keep them where they used to going, and where they're known. They could help out with the animals. Perhaps they'd like that. Not many farm animals in London, that's for sure. He was just thinking about how the boys would like feeding the little goslings when they hatch out, when his musings were interrupted by the sound of a distant vehicle. He turned from his seat to look out of the window towards the bottom of the lane. It was the baker's van. He saw Margaret getting out and opening the gate. She drove through, got out again, and shut the gate behind her and drove on up to the garage. "Lil," he called out, getting up and looking, going to the front door, to the foot of the stairs. "Look out of the window and see who's coming up the path. 'Tis Maggie." Lil came hurrying down the stairs. "Margaret," she said, determined to call the arrival by her full name. "I thought she was only coming on Tuesdays. Hello, dear. What a nice surprise to see. I shall have seen you twice this week now. Come in and sit down. What's happened to Morris?" "Oh, hello, Lil. Hello, Stan. No, it's me again. It looks like I'll be coming every Tuesday and Friday for a while. As you know, Morris is the new relief driver taking Ron's place until his leg mends. But Morris can't do Tuesdays and Fridays because he's got a stall in Barnstable Market and won't give that up for anything. That's only fair. He grows a lot of his own produce, but Bert isn't pleased and says he's being unreasonable." Margaret mimicked the offended tone that Bert had used. "Good to see, maid," said Stan. Lil took the basket and directed Margaret to the table where a place had been laid for Morris. "Well, you won't be taking anybody else's place for a while, Margaret, will he?" "I shall see regular," Lil smiled. "Dinner is all ready, and then I'll tell you the news about this afternoon." "I'll go and get on then, you two." Stan knocked out his pipe and put it in the pot on the mantelpiece. "Come on then, Bruce." Bruce slunk out from under the table and the two of them went out. "Oh, that crafty Doug gets in here. He knows he's not supposed to be indoors, but Stan encourages it. Trouble is, Margaret, I come way down in the pecking order round here, with every four-legged creature and two-legged ones way above me. But there's something I want to tell you about. Best thing is, you read this letter that was held up in the post. It only came this morning. I'll go and make a pot of tea." Margaret finished her pudding and then read the letter that Lil had handed to her. "Well, it all seems rather sudden, Lil. They're coming this afternoon with..." She paused and read in a rather posh voice, "Mrs. Ellington Smythe." Lil nodded and she and Margaret cleared the table. "Come on, Lil, I'll wash up. I've finished my round and you've given me a lovely dinner. Let me help you get ready for them and then I'll go. They'll be here soon." They cleared up, wiped the table and set out some tea things and a plate of cakes that Margaret took from the basket. "Let me pay for those as well as my bread," Lil said. No, Lil, just pay for the bread. The cakes are my treat, and they're cheaper anyway if they're not sold by the end of the day. Lil settled up with her order and looked at Margaret. Is there something wrong, Lil? Margaret asked, picking up her basket and preparing to leave. Well, I was going to ask you if you'd stay a bit and be here when they come. I'm so nervous and I'm bound to say the wrong thing. Well, I could stay if you're really sure I won't be in the way. I finished the round a lot earlier than last time. I know the route now and can drive the van better. Lil sighed. Oh, good. Stan will be back in a minute, and he won't think of the sort of questions us women would. She looked up from setting down the tea tray. Talk of the devil! Stan walked into the kitchen, but this time he stopped Bruce slinking in and hiding under the table. Out you go, Doug, he said. They'm here, Lil. Not 2:30 yet. He looked out of the window to see that a car had been left at the bottom of the lane and a woman was walking up to the house accompanied by 2 boys. I'll put the kettle on, said Lil, all of a fluster. Margaret sat in the corner by the fire, trying to be out of sight. It took some time for the 3 newcomers to reach the steps to the house. The boys kept stopping to look at the animals, some sheep who had wandered from the far field into the field by the lane. The lambs were a big attraction, but suddenly they scampered off at the arrival of 4 geese and a gander who came towards the visitors, their necks stretched out and making an awful penetrating screech. Stan went outside to greet the party as they came up the steps to the front door, carrying their little cases and leaving them at the bottom of the stairs in the hall. Oh, hello, Mrs. Smith. I'm Stan Webber. Come in, boys. I'm Mrs. Ellington Smythe, said Mrs. Ellington Smythe with a slightly admonishing look at Stan. And these are Jimmy and Danny. Take off your caps, boys, and say hello to Mr. and Mrs. Webber. Jimmy said, hello, and Danny looked down at the floor and then at the bright red glow from the range. Lil introduced herself and Margaret to the new arrivals and invited everyone to sit at the table. She'd found a bag of odds and ends of toys she'd kept for when her nephews and nieces visited. You can sit on the floor over there if you want, she said, giving the bag to Jimmy. Or you could go outside on the step and meet Bruce, Stan said, looking closely at Danny, who appeared anxious and uncomfortable. The boys took the toy bag and went outside and sat on the top step. Bruce came up to them, tail wagging, and was immediately fussed over and cuddled. Back in the kitchen, Mrs. Ellington Smythe went through some of the formalities of billeting and produced forms which Stan and Lil read and signed, but not until they'd got Margaret to read them through first and received a nod of approval from her. When the formalities had been completed, the boys were called inside and everyone sat around the table and had tea, the cakes proving a big success with the young ones. Lil made an effort to talk to Jimmy. She wanted to put him at ease. We don't know London, Jimmy, she said, smiling at him. It's a big place, missus, he replied through a mouthful of cake. And we was bombed. He swallowed and looked serious for a moment. Danny said nothing, just looking on, but in another world. Jimmy, put in Mrs. Ellington Smythe, we were bombed. She looked at him, waiting for him to repeat what she had said. Was you, missus? I didn't think you was bombed here in the country. Mrs. Ellington Smythe thought she would have another try at working on Jimmy's grammar. We weren't bombed, but you just said you was. Jimmy wiped his mouth with the back of his hand while looking straight at the lady. Margaret thought she should jump into the conversation to avoid any more confusion on both sides. Did you see the geese, boys? They scare me a bit, but I think you have to shout back at them when they cackle and hiss at you. I've tried that, and they turn and waddle away. Jimmy smiled and looked at his brother. We do that, won't we, Danny? He put his hand on his younger brother's shoulder as Danny looked up at him with a little worried smile. Jimmy looked around the table at everyone and said, I talks for him 'cause he don't talk no more. Not since the bomb fell in the street at the back of our house. We had a rabbit hutch at the end of our garden with 2 lovely little rabbits. They was both killed in the blast. He ain't talked since." Silence fell around the table. Sunnybank was another world, Lil thought. She looked at Margaret, who was trying to wipe away a tear. "Us'll do our best for the boys, won't us, Stan?" Mrs. Ellington Smythe got up to leave. She was biting her lip. "I know you will, Mrs. Webber, and I will send you further information in the post very soon. Thank you." She smiled and stretched out her hand. The ungrammatical mixture of the English language in both Devonshire and Cockney accents now suddenly seemed of little importance. Stan stood up and nodded. "And you can call us Uncle and Auntie," he said. "Now, boys, what about coming and helping me with milking the cows?" They shot off down the steps and along the path towards the milking shed. The 3 ladies looked at each other and smiled. And so the story goes on. And I hope that if you do get to reading the book, you'll enjoy it. My good friend Cheryl, who lives in the village where I live here in Loxhaw in North Devon, has designed and painted the cover so beautifully. And she has the cottage, the Devon Longhouse. She has Stan here on his bike, and she has Lil, his wife, and she's holding out a dinner. And don't forget, in those days, working class people called what we often call lunch dinner. And she cooked a dinner for the old major who lived a little way along the road, and Stan used to take it to him every day on his bike after he'd finished his post round. And there's my mother visiting them with her dog Bruce, or at least Stan and Lil's dog Bruce. There he is. And at the top, Woolacombe Bay, with the Americans, some of them practicing their manoeuvres on the beach, the Sherman tank that Cheryl has researched so carefully, and the landing craft. And of course, when the troops came, it's quite shocking to know that they practiced with live ammunition. And then 1943 saw them in and around North Devon when they came in their thousands, most of them coming on September the 1st. I hope you enjoy Just Making Do.